Welcome back. Today we are unpacking a seriously fascinating explainer on the underlying structural and geopolitical forces that are completely shaping the modern Pacific. We so often think of global standoffs in terms of today's headlines, right? Like who said what on the news or who sailed a ship where. But right beneath that daily news cycle, there are these deep tectonic forces that have literally driven human empires for millennia. I'm talking about geography, logistics, human psychology. So in this explainer, we're going to look at the current geopolitical board, not just through the lens of modern defense strategy, but through the hard-earned, gritty lessons of ancient history. It's like a giant puzzle, and we're putting the pieces together.
To really wrap our heads around this tension, let's step into the near future for a second. The year is 2026. Picture a lone merchant sailor standing on the deck of a container ship, watching the horizon where the turquoise waters of the South China Sea meet this thick haze of gray steel. And he isn't checking the weather. He's looking at the shadows of destroyers. He's listening to the silent hum of drones circling way up above. Carrier strike groups are quietly shadowing island fortresses that, for all intents and purposes, have been turned into unsinkable aircraft carriers. Now, for decades, this ocean has been the world's absolutely vital maritime artery, just pulsing with global trade. But today, it feels like a fuse waiting for a spark. And the terrifying question this explainer poses is this: what happens if a simple miscalculation near some lonely coral reef accidentally ignites a total firestorm?
Okay, let's dive into this and look at our roadmap. We are going to cover the brewing Pacific Stalemate, lessons from Rome and Persia, the tyranny of distance, choke points and escalatory ladders, and finally, avoiding the forever war.
All right, kicking things off with sections 1 and 2, the Pacific Stalemate and lessons from Rome and Persia.
So, when tensions spike, leaders often fall into this incredibly dangerous illusion that conflicts are going to be quick. You know the drill. The troops will be home by Christmas. But to understand why the US and China are actually structurally stuck in this grinding deadlock, we've got to look back at the one enemy that truly, genuinely tested the Roman Empire, and that was Persia. See, Rome didn't fight Persia the way they fought disjointed barbarian tribes. Persia was a true peer rival. They had their own sophisticated economy, massive armies, and a deeply entrenched state ideology. Rome could win a pitched battle here, or maybe temporarily sack a capital there, but a permanent, decisive victory, it was basically impossible. And the modern Pacific standoff is incredibly similar. We're looking at two massive systems bound by deep structural constraints and completely incompatible visions. It's a pure rivalry where a quick, decisive conquest simply slips away the second you try to grasp it.
Moving right along to Section 3, the tyranny of distance and logistical warfare. Okay, if ideology is the spark of a rivalry, logistics is the cold water that ultimately decides just how long that fire is going to burn. Throughout all of human history, logistics has been the silent killer of empires. Just look at this number. 56. When the Romans marched out east to confront the Persians, they consistently hit a massive logistical breaking point. Just to keep a relatively modest force of about 27,500 men and their horses moving, the Roman war machine required 56 metric tons of grain and fodder. And wait, that's not every month. That wasn't even every week. That was every single day. If those supply lines faltered even a little, the army starved. And it didn't matter one bit how well trained they were. And this brilliantly illustrates the modern dilemma. If you connect that ancient Roman grain issue to the modern Pacific, you see the exact same logistical nightmare. If the US wants to project power thousands of miles from its own shores, the sheer volume of material required is staggering. And we aren't just talking about food anymore, right? Every single gallon of jet fuel, every highly specialized spare part for a stealth aircraft or a complex radar system, it all has to be physically transported across a vast, highly vulnerable ocean. It is literally an accountant's nightmare masquerading as a military operation. Now, on the other side of that ocean, China utilizes a concept called strategic depth. Because of its massive coastline and just vast internal geography, it has this structural luxury of being able to absorb initial strikes and hide critical military assets. They can spread drone facilities and precision missile launchers across heavily fortified structures over thousands of miles. The source material actually draws a direct parallel here to how the modern Iranian military utilizes deep, hardened bunkers to survive an adversary's air domination. The logic is simple. You just can't easily knock out a target that's buried deep within a massive, geographically complex homeland.
Which brings us to Section 4, escalatory ladders and maritime choke points.
Let's see how this builds, because if one side realizes they can't get a quick victory thanks to all that strategic depth and distance, they don't just throw up their hands and give up. No, they escalate. This is known as the escalatory ladder of maritime warfare.
Step 1 is the initial conflict. You target military bases and naval assets. But when the geography makes a quick win impossible, military leaders step up to rung 2. They target the enemy's energy hubs to paralyze their forces. And if that still doesn't force a surrender, well, they step up to rung 3, a total unrestricted trade war. Suddenly, what started as a localized military fight has rapidly mutated into a global economic catastrophe.
To really grasp how devastating that third step is, we have to talk about global maritime choke points. Think about the Strait of Hormuz over in the Middle East. Closing it is the ultimate geopolitical leverage because it triggers a global energy crisis that impacts absolutely everyone. While in the Pacific, the Malacca Strait plays the exact same role. It is a completely vital artery for global trade and energy. If one superpower tries to choke off the other's energy supply through this strait, they risk sparking a total energy war. And the explainer makes this crystal clear. This is the ultimate deterrent. The cost of winning this way is literally a total collapse of global society. It's an economic meltdown that neither side can actually afford to inherit.
And finally, Section 5, the Forever War and Avoiding the Trap.
So you might be wondering, if the geography makes winning impossible, and the escalatory ladder makes escalating straight up suicidal, why don't rival nations just pack up and call it a day? It all comes down to the sunk cost fallacy. You've probably heard of this. It's a psychological phenomenon where a nation pours such massive resources, money, pride, and human lives, into a conflict that it becomes politically and psychologically impossible to withdraw without a clear, definitive win. In a modern standoff between nuclear-armed giants, pushing for that elusive victory doesn't bring peace. It just creates a vicious cycle. One side takes a loss, so they send more troops and ships to avenge it, which inflicts a loss on the other side, who then turns around and does the exact same thing.
Now, what's really interesting about this historical precedent is that initial setbacks actually breed much longer, grittier wars. The explainer points to a fascinating 9th century example, Alfred the Great. When Alfred was ambushed and literally forced to hide in a swamp, he didn't just surrender to an overwhelming force. He utilized that sunk cost fallacy and waged a brutal guerrilla war. He disrupted supply lines, he plundered estates, and he dragged the conflict out until he could finally force a decisive showdown at Edington. The huge takeaway here is that an initial overwhelming strike rarely ends a war. It usually just drives your enemy into the marshes to fight a much longer, far more agonizing campaign.
And that brings us full circle, right back to our ancient timeline. Rome and Persia clashed in the 1st century. By the 4th century, their ideological divides had only deepened. By the 7th century, they had fought on and off for 7 total centuries. And in the end, they achieved almost nothing. The empires were simply too big, too stable, and their state ideologies were way too resistant to integration. They were completely locked in a massive structural trap of their own making. Neither could win, and neither could afford to quit.
So, the crucial point we are left with is this absolutely chilling question. Are we looking at a modern forever war in the East? The US and China, much like Rome and Persia, have visions of the world that just cannot be easily reconciled through a single battle or treaty. The underlying structural constraints, the absolute tyranny of distance, the vast strategic depth, the devastating reality of maritime choke points, all of it points toward a grinding stalemate rather than a swift resolution. The ultimate fate of the 21st century might not actually rest on who has the better missiles or the fastest ships, but on whether modern leaders have the historical awareness to step off that escalatory ladder before the entire global economy burns down around them. It is a monumental test of geopolitical restraint. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope it gave you a powerful new framework for viewing the shifting tides in the Pacific. Catch you next time.